Welcome to the Principal's Perspective, where we explore what it really takes to lead a school and why great leadership is a way of being and a set of skills that can be learned. I'm Dr. Adrian Camm.
And I'm Teagan Collins. Whether you're leading a school, an organisation, or preparing for your next leadership move, we're here to break down the strategies, challenges, and real-life moments that define leadership today.
This podcast is your guide to navigating leadership with clarity, confidence, and impact.
Let's get into today's episode.
How are you, Teagan?
Well, thank you. How are you?
Good, thanks. I was just reflecting on our executive meeting last week and we had an interesting activity that we all engaged in.
Very. Why don't you share a little bit more about that? It was your idea.
So we finished the meeting by challenging all the executive members to come up with a personal anthem or a theme song or some entrance music. Imagine that you're walking onto stage and you've got some music playing in the background and people are going to give you a thunderous round of applause. And so we all went away and chose a song that we thought might represent us in some particular way. And then we engaged in some trivia trying to match the song to the particular executive member. It was good fun.
It was good fun.
What was your song?
I found it very difficult to narrow it down to one. Aqua was featuring in there. A bit of Dr. Jones you can never go wrong with as an entrance song.
Nice. Very nice.
What about you?
I had two songs, actually, depending upon the context of the day. One was a song by a band called War in 1975, and the track title was called Why Can't We Be Friends? And so that generated a bit of laughter. And the rationale behind me choosing that particular track was that sometimes in our roles, we're dealing with people who are frustrated, people who are perhaps have been hurt, people who are angry, sometimes people who are just looking to pick a fight. And so having that song play in my mind as I'm entering into some of those situations or conversations can actually put things in perspective. But the other one was when I was having a particularly bad day. This song was more motivational, and it was You're the Best by Joe Esposito, 1984. And it was for those audience members who perhaps are of a similar vintage to me, that's one of the main tracks on the movie The Karate Kid. I don't think I'm the best, but it definitely gives me some motivation if I'm perhaps having a challenging day.
I'm going to have it playing when you walk into every meeting now. That's going to be the entrance song.
Shall we get started?
It's a good segue.
Let's get started. So the focus of the podcast today, Teagan, is the hidden curriculum of leadership, the lessons that they don't teach you before becoming a principal. And what if the most important lessons about being a principal aren't in the textbooks or the professional learning programs? What if they're learnt in the moments when no one's watching, when the stakes are high, and when you're forced to confront who you really are as a leader? This is the hidden curriculum of principalship, the unspoken, real-world lessons that emerge only through experience. So the episode today is going to explore leadership as a complex, messy, and deeply personal endeavour. But it's also an incredibly exciting role for personal transformation, growth, and impact. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. The hidden curriculum are part of the lessons that shape you into the leader you're meant to be. And I think a really good starting point for our conversation today, Teagan, is talking about the emotional labour or the emotional intensity that comes with the job. Because no one really talks about that when you first become principal, and it is a full spectrum of emotions that come with the role, and sometimes it's a full spectrum of emotions each day. So leadership isn't just about the tough moments when we're talking about that emotional labour or intensity. It's about how you deal with adversity, and it's about how you navigate your way through those emotions in the day-to-day. So it's the highs and the lows, and being able to almost swing on that pendulum and being able to be okay with that. So let's acknowledge the lows as a starting point for our conversation first. And let's talk about the things that really weigh heavily on us as principals or as an associate principal in our day-to-day work. Where do we start?
I suppose pieces that come to mind straight away are in the critical incidents that we manage with our community, whether it be staff, students, parents, perhaps waiting for the 10:30 email from PM email from a parent if you've met with them that day, or there's been a major student incident. I've talked about this before on the podcast about how I still have a handball to you, not as principal yet, but I can imagine When you're principal for the first time, you don't have that handball anymore. And I don't know what that feels like, but I imagine that weighs heavily too when we start talking around finances or board management. You are the ultimate shoulder that lands on.
It can be lonely at times. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, there's definitely a weight or a burden that you do feel when you step into that role for the first time, knowing that ultimately the responsibility sits with you and no one else. I'm very fortunate that we have a great working relationship and we can talk about all things related to our school. But it is lonely at the top, as the cliche goes, and the emotional toll can be significant. You talked about critical incidents, students, staff, parent behaviour, late night emails, people who are unhappy, people who are frustrated. And we haven't even touched on things like legal issues that the school might be facing in a broad range of areas, making sure the school's financially viable now and in the years to come, but also talking about potentially historical matters, cybersecurity incidents, risk management. There is a lot there that can really get you down if you're not careful with how you approach the role. And so what are some of the strategies you use, Teagan, when you're having a particularly tough day or a tough morning or a tough week, when everything seems to be going wrong? How do you reframe that in the positive?
It's a difficult question, but it's something we talk about a lot and something which I talk about too with particularly heads of school and our head of campus around our colleagues, and they are at the face of a lot of these issues. And unfortunately, 95% of our day is dealing with the less than 5% of the community that may be unhappy. So it's a perspective, putting some boundaries in place, which can be really hard. I had a conversation this morning with one of our colleagues around the tossing and turning overnight. We're deliberating on a really difficult decision and it's not easy. There's a human side of things. There's always a young person at the centre or a staff member at the centre of an issue. So trying to be kind to ourselves in that moment too is probably the second one. Perspective is really important, coming from a place of kindness and empathy and giving ourselves a scope that we can change our minds. And I think that we can be really black and white sometimes and think that there is a black and white answer, but there can be grey and we're able to change our minds. So holding space for heavy decisions is probably something that falls into place there as well. And finally, how I manage my own emotions and the pressure would be to find the good. Where is the good in the day? And if you look at your calendar and you're thinking, gosh, I've got some really big, tough conversations today or decisions to make, how are you balancing that? And where can I find some joy? And actively looking for it, because sometimes you need to.
We might talk about highs or the positives or the joy of the role shortly, but let's not move past the lows and let's just stay in that space for a little bit in terms of the emotional fortitude I think you need to be able to deal with all the things that can come at you at any given time. There's a lot of proactiveness required in a leadership role, but there's also the reactiveness and the day-to-day because you never quite know what's going to happen on any given day. So how do you develop that fortitude? If I think about the things that have happened to me throughout my life that have led me to this point, I think sometimes that fortitude is developed in your moments of adversity and that battle scars almost, if you like, to use that phrase. And the more that you've been through, the more equipped you are to be able to deal with the challenges that come to you. And I know the feedback we've both received in different forums from our colleagues and from those that we work with is that we are both calm and we have grace under pressure. And that's absolutely required in situations of challenge and things that are causing you issue.
I can think back to moments in my journey where I didn't have that emotional resilience and small matters seemed really big in my world. And they were big at the time, so I don't want to diminish them. But you're right. I think back to moments where I've thought, oh, why am I having this conversation with this parent or this student or this family? And shouldn't someone above me be having this conversation? But they tasked me with that duty and, of course, held my hand a little bit. I look back now and can see, oh, we had the pre-conversation, we had the coaching conversation, we talked through what options there might be. That was really important for me as a middle leader to have those difficult conversations for not only my growth personally, but also within my position, within that leadership position, to be seen as a leader that's not just having the administrative or the pedagogical conversations, but we actually have the tough conversations that matter.
I like that. And it makes me think of, if we look at our days on average, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with that require that emotional resilience are often other people's problems. They're not problems that we have directly caused or have been directly involved in. And so it is about, to an extent, taking your ego out of the equation and trying to look as objectively as possible at things that may be happening. And people get really heightened because whatever the issue is really serious to them in that moment in time. And without being disrespectful or without being diminishing of people's emotional reactions, the situations they're working through, oftentimes they're not life or death. And so it is just about making sure that you can talk through whatever the issue is with the person, removing yourself from that equation and reaching an outcome that's satisfactory.
Absolutely. As you were reflecting on that, something that came to mind was also we're often sometimes dealing with people that are coming to us and it's a triangle. So it's about somebody else. It's about an incident that they manage, but there's been fallout. And I know we've talked about this in previous episodes around building capacity and building capability to empower them to be able to go away and have that conversation themselves. But having the professional judgment call to know, where do I step in, how do I step in and why, without disempowering people, is also a labour and toll that adds into that emotionality.
It's also about knowing your triggers, isn't it? And what triggers you personally, emotionally, might have something going on in your personal life that can impact how you're showing up each day. I think you get better at dealing with the emotional swings of the role with experience. But one of the things I really worry about, and probably my greatest fear at this point, is becoming so hardened that you almost forget or lose that emotionality and that ability to experience your full gamut of emotions because you develop your thick skin, your armor. And I'm really worried about that.
Me too. But I think the fact that we're worried about it speaks to perhaps the gravity of we won't ever let that happen.
I hope not.
In terms of the authenticity or genuine nature of those conversations and the gravity we feel in the decisions that we make, because we're human and difficult conversations are difficult for a reason. It's not something to be taken lightly ever, but if we walked into those conversations enjoying them, there'd be something wrong.
There'd be something wrong.
We remind each other of that often, same with our colleagues when they're preparing for a difficult conversation. Often we're going to these conversations without the full picture, despite all of the information gathering and intel. So we do need to use our professional judgment, but if we're coming from a place of kindness, coming from a place of empathy and coming from a place of seeking to understand and listen, then I think that has to weigh into our constitution as well.
I love that. So we're really talking about the emotional labour, the emotional intensity and the resilience and fortitude that's required in the role. But we've been focusing on the negative. But of course, there's some incredible positives and highs that you experience, some joys that you experience in the role. And oftentimes they all happen in the one day. And so you can jump on that pendulum from things that are really hard and things that are really difficult to things that are so positive and make you so happy. So let's focus on that for a minute. What are some of the things in your day that really bring you joy in your role as associate principal?
There's some of the small things which I can talk to, but I think it's also important to highlight the why of why become a principal. Why does it matter? Why am I aspiring to be a principal? Why did you sign on the dotted line to become a principal? For me, my motivation is I feel as though you can have the biggest difference. You can have the biggest impact. We get into teaching because we love teaching. You then appointed into leadership positions that pulls you further and further away from the classroom. And you get more and more time fraction to do your more and more senior role. And then all of a sudden you've gone from teaching a full load to 0.8 to 0.6 to 0.4 to 0.2. And it can remove us from the why. But something that I can justify in my own mind to think, okay, well, I used to teach 240 or 260 students, but I can have a bigger impact to the thousands of young people that are in our care. So that drives the why for me. That is the ultimate high in terms of the impact that we can have. Do you see the value in the classroom? Don't get me wrong, I see that value too every single day. But think about the impact you can have on a greater scale when you can lead teams, when you could lean into that. So that's one of my highs that I remind myself of. But then it's the small moments too. It's getting out of the office, even just being in Central, which is our student cafe, the passing conversations, seeing the smile on the student's face when you ask them about debating or chess, how did that go yesterday? And when they know that you see them, that they matter to you. And to me, that brings great joy. What about for you?
When I think about the highs or the joy, I'm always reminded of one of my favourite quotes by the poet Khalil Gibran, who basically says, the deeper sorrow carves into our being, the more joy we can contain. It's not because I'm sorrowful or the role of principal is so bad, but I think when we experience the lows, it makes the highs even better. And for me, it is the interactions that I have with the junior school students when I'm walking through the playground and hearing them all yell out, Dr. Camm, and they come running over and they want to talk to you about something or just hang out for a little while and have a chat. They're the moments that really matter. But the things that bring me the most joy are sometimes things that no one else knows about in the organisation. And that can be challenging too. So we have students, we have families, we have staff who are going through deeply personal situations, tragic family situations in some cases. And there are some things as a principal you can do to support them through their moment of need. Now, whether it's providing bursaries to alleviate financial burdens on families for tuition fees, whether it's providing some extra annual leave, whatever it is, sometimes there's things that you can put in place that change people's lives. And no one knows about them.
It's hidden.
The hidden curriculum. Might be a nice segue, Teagan, into our next topic of our hidden curriculum, I think, which no one teaches you when you become a principal, but it is the political landscape that you need to navigate. We can talk about politics in terms of the big P, which is the external politics that we have to embrace as leaders in independent schools, which ultimately relate to school funding or mandated top-down approaches, policy, compliance, regulations, and those sorts of things that you have to work through. But I think we need to focus on politics little p in terms of the internal politics or the political landscape that we navigate within our school contexts. What are your thoughts on that?
I think as a previous director of rowing, a lot of my little p politics, my skills were honed in what can be a very political environment with deeply invested people and stakeholders, not only parents, but within the broader community. I feel as though I learnt so much of my little p in my role at that time. And it's the people work, it's the navigating, it's making sure you're closing the loop on communications, doing what you say you're going to do and following through with that, not leaving any stone unturned. It perhaps can be wished away or it can be glossed over, but I still think you need to manage it. We need to manage it. We need to make sure that we're cutting through.
I think it's incumbent upon principals to be activists when we're talking about engaging in the external politics or the capital P politics, because we should be advocating for the profession, we should be advocating for our school, and we should be engaging at an appropriate level to try and influence. But that word influence, I think, is really interesting when we talk about our internal politics or our little p politics that we work through. We would like to think at our school there is no politics, there is no game playing. And I actually like to think of myself as apolitical in some regards, but I think that's naive. It's really naive.
At the end of the day, we're a workplace with hundreds of employees. I think we'd be very naive to think that the little p politics don't go on.
They absolutely go on.
But how do you cut it out?
And what games are people playing and for what reason and to what end? And ultimately, it's about power, in my experience. It's about people jostling for power. It's about people jostling for position. It's about people trying to present themselves in a particular way to get an outcome in some way. So I think we can minimise the politics that happen internally by talking about it, making it explicit, stating what we stand for, and then actually talking about the way we can go about conversations, the way we can go about jostling for position in a healthy way rather than a competitive way, and the way that we can then use that to influence decisions or outcomes in the positive for the school. What are some of the ways that you've seen work in the past of people who are really astute at influencing others?
As you were talking, I was just thinking about our leadership principles and how the work that was done within that sets a really clear framework around our expectations. But in terms of influencing, and influencing in a positive sense too, I think the word influence can come with a negative connotation. If I think about it from the positive lens and how we can influence people in a positive way, for me it comes down to people know my values. I like to think that they know who I am as a person, for the human element, but also what I stand for as a leader. And really, it sounds cliche, but living our values, if we see it, if we hear it, we call it out with empathy, because sometimes that jostling comes from a place of vulnerability, or it comes from a place of wanting to be seen, perhaps.
Ambition, misplaced or perhaps slightly misguided ambition, because you can still be ambitious without engaging in the politics or the shadow side of politics. And that our leadership principles, absolutely, leading in all directions is one that comes to mind for me, because oftentimes when people are engaged in game playing, whether they know it or not, they're actually leading in a particular direction but not taking a 360 or a holistic view of their leadership. So they might lead up really, really well, but the experience of the direct reports is much different. And so we need to be providing people with the feedback regularly, often, to make sure that we're eliminating that as much as possible in the organisation.
Open and honest conversations.
Open and honest conversations. So we're talking about the emotional labour, the emotional intensity of the role, and the political acumen required to navigate the internal landscape of your school or your organisation. How do you frame your own identity in that context, Teagan? You've got your personal identity and your professional identity. And how do you separate the two? Let's face it, we know that the role of the principal is pretty much always on. You have to be always on call, but there does have to be some separation. You do have to create boundaries. So how do you separate that identity so that when you're at home, you are providing your loved ones with hopefully the best version of yourself?
We talk about not putting the armour on, being us as people, but that can make it hard to separate. Perhaps in my first year or 6 months even of stepping into this role, I had a certain vision of what I had to bring. And I think too, I overlaid from an identity perspective, well, this is how I have to show up from a work perspective and keep parts of personal Teagan hidden, or who I really am hidden. And I've tried to make a really deliberate and conscious effort to not put the armour on every day, because that's exhausting too if you're living in two separate worlds and you're not being your true self when you turn up to work every day. So that was a big learning for me, but it does blur the lines and blur the boundaries, because where does it end? So it's a work in progress is the short of the long of it, or the long of the short of it. When you make a mistake too, or if something hits in the wrong direction or doesn't quite land the way you want it to, you own it. And what are we going to do about it to fix it? But turning up and being present at home is a really important one too. But that comes into work-life balance. Is there such a thing? I don't think there's such a thing. I don't like the phrase. But who we are at home and who we are at work, and what that looks like.
I think leadership definitely changes you. One of the things that happened to me last week is I was at home, and you might laugh at this, but I was talking to my wife and she came up with this idea, and I said, well, why don't you send me a one-page proposal? And what she said to me, she goes, I'm not one of your employees. So leadership definitely changes you for the good and for the better, for the worse maybe. But it does come down to being true to who you are, your authentic self, and being able to navigate that emotional intensity, the political landscape, and being able to influence not just your immediate team, but having that broader sphere of influence that you were talking about before across your school. I want to come back to influence for a minute. You were saying before it has that negative connotation potentially attached to it. What's the difference between influence and persuasion? And how can you use your influence outside of your position in the organisation to initiate successful change in your school?
If we're influencing for the good, it's helping to see the bigger picture, or persuading, whether it's a change project, whether we want people aligned. We're not seeking consensus, so we're seeking alignment. What does that look like? But if we're providing the bigger picture, for me, that's part of my influence strategy. Are people looking at the project from a specific lens, and often they're looking at it from their lens, what does it mean for me? How can I help to influence their thinking by providing that bigger picture, providing them why? Where does this fit within our school strategy as an example, rather than just how it's going to impact on the ground for them? That's an example of how we can influence for the positive. But then also there comes a time where we don't need total agreement either. We need consensus, do we?
Well, that's a really interesting point. We don't need 100% consensus. We don't need 100% alignment. And I don't think you'll ever get that, because we both encourage healthy debate, rigorous debate. We invite challenge, we invite dissenting opinions, because we believe that by mining for conflict, we actually get the best outcome for the school. So if everyone was just turning up and nodding their head and saying yes all the time, that's not a healthy culture.
Be boring too.
Very boring. But I think you don't need consensus and full alignment, but what you do need is an element of trust. And I think trust is the currency of leadership, which enables you to influence things in a particular direction. People don't have to like you. They don't have to be your friend, but they have to have an understanding that you're going to act with integrity, you're going to follow through on what you say you're going to do, and you're going to act in the best interests of the school and the people that are involved in that community. People aren't interested in your title. People are interested in what you are going to do, and ultimately they'll get on board with whatever it is you're proposing.
What you're bringing to the table.
It's that cliche, isn't it? People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Do you like that?
It's cliche, but I do. Humanises the role, humanises principals, and we do care. And even though we may not have the day-to-day interaction with every one of our colleagues, when they do come to one of us at their point in need, that's what I hope they feel. Do you like it?
I do. There's a lot to unpack in that statement, I think. They don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. But caring has to mean that you have their best interests at heart, balancing the competing demands and priorities and the tensions that you're experiencing across the school when you're working within a complex human-centred organisations, making hundreds of decisions a day and trying to get the best outcome for everyone overall. So the hidden curriculum of becoming a principal, Teagan, the emotional intensity, the emotional labour of the job, no one ever teaches you that. Navigating the political landscape. Politics with a capital P, so being an activist externally, but also navigating the internal politics of your school or organisation, or politics with a little p. And then we've just talked briefly around influence, trust, and how you can persuade others to either get on board, to align, or to be part of some sort of change initiative. And we have talked about how leadership changes you, and it definitely changes you. I used to think 5 years ago that leadership was one thing, and now I think it is something a little bit different. Philosophically, I haven't changed my position entirely, but through experience and through my learnings and through my ongoing education, I think about things differently than I used to. And I think about things in a more sophisticated way. So how do you make sure that you're continuing on that journey, Teagan, when you are caught up in the day-to-day and you've got 100 things on your to-do list, your calendar's full of meetings, you've got people knocking on the door saying, can I have a minute? How do you make sure that you're sustaining yourself for your career journey in leadership, which has got many, many years to come?
It's part of the reason why I'm studying, to break up the day-to-day, even though you think, oh gosh, I really could do without this. I really could do without needing to read this book. But I walk away from my time with my head in that space feeling energised and with a different perspective. That's a big one for me. And another one that springs to mind is having people in a similar position to me outside of our context. So holding opportunities for those casual conversations that I might have with another deputy principal at another school, at a conference or at a networking event. We can look around the room and we know that there's other people going through the same thing. We know there's others carrying the same emotional labour and intensity, and picking up the phone to say, hey, I've got this on my plate. How would you handle it? What would you do? Let's talk through it. And often it's just that piece of reflection or the solace in knowing, yes, it is lonely at the top, but there's lots of other people in the same situation as well.
So with your study, because we've mentioned it a few times in previous episodes, but we've never actually gone into what you're actually doing. So you're doing a PhD, and what are you focusing on? Because you and I have spoken off the intellectual stimulation that further study can provide. But why don't you share with our listeners what it is you're actually researching?
It's topical given what we're talking about today. My broad research question is focusing on independent school principals and how they manage and perceive the pressures of their work. And then by virtue, what factors play into that, talking about their life history, their life journeys, also thinking about what implications the way that they manage the pressures of the role has on the broader school communities that they play a role in, talking about context, how many different stakeholders are they managing within the context of their schools, because we know that the independent sector is so diverse. And that is the real contribution of the research to the field, is the independent system within Australia is heavily under-researched. And we know that there's reasons for that, because the focus has been on the public system, and rightly so, and we're seeing a redistribution, if you like. We're seeing that with funding. Even though for us it's a real impact on independent schools, the policymakers behind closed doors, rightly so, would say, well, this is a redistribution of funds across the education sector. So by virtue, the independent school system in Australia has been under-researched from that lens. But my research is advocating for the fact that independent schools are here to stay. So we need to know more about principals in these schools. We need to know more about the pressures of their roles. And we've talked about that. We know the list of pressures. We've focused on that today in our conversations. But it's more, from my perspective, looking at the diversity of the independent sector, principals as the leader of the ship, and then what implications that has for them and their communities.
Oh, it sounds fascinating. And how far along are you?
About a year in to what is a very long 8-year journey as a part-time student. But for me, it's about that, as you spoke about earlier, that intellectual stimulation and providing some space and thought for me to be curious, to continue to put myself out of my comfort zone, because my comfort zone is coursework. Give me the question and I'll give you the answer. But I'm really enjoying this period of time right now. What it looks like is potentially 6 case studies, 6 principals across a diverse range of independent schools across Australia. So stay tuned.
Okay, looking forward to hearing more about it. Comfort zone's an interesting one, because oftentimes our biggest learnings come from things that are really hard, or the things that are really challenging, or our most difficult moments are when we learn the most. Often we don't learn a lot from our successes. But we can. But the biggest learning, or the most powerful learning, comes from those moments of challenge where we've had to really dig deep into our emotional reservoir and come through the other end and reflect and change something about what we do in order to be the leader that we both want and need to be. That's a really nice segue, I think, Teagan, into our segment of the podcast that we call In the Trenches, where we try and be a little bit vulnerable and share some really practical experiences that we've both had in relation to the topic or theme of the particular episode. And given the episode today is about the hidden curriculum of leadership, or the lessons that they don't teach in principal professional learning programs, the question I've got for you today to consider is, what is the hardest leadership lesson that you have learned in your career to date?
How much time have we got?
We've got as long as you need.
The hardest leadership lesson. There's a few things that are whirring around in my mind. I can think back to a really pivotal point for me was the first time that I was leading a conversation around a young person that was no longer going to be rejoining our community. And for me, it was a really tough lesson around making the hard calls, making the tough decisions and following them through, and how they don't get easier over time. So I think it goes back to us talking about not becoming hardened. And for me, that was the specific moment in time where I can pinpoint these conversations are never going to be easy. They matter. It's a turning point for a young person in their life. And I'm playing a really pivotal role in that decision. And that was a really hard lesson to learn, to say, if this is where I want to be in my career and if I'm an aspiring principal, which I am, there's going to be tough conversations. So I have to be comfortable in having those tough conversations without losing myself and without losing that empathy. So that was a realisation that is a part of the job that will never go away.
The right call for the school, the right decision, the right outcome doesn't make it easier.
What about for you? Hardest lesson you've had to learn?
The more experience I have, the more I realise how much I don't know. So I don't know if I can keep it to one, but I'm thinking about three things in particular. Even though I believe that my leadership philosophy, that the way I'm perceived by others is centred in a humility, perhaps that wasn't always so. And I think 10 to 12 years ago, I used to come in thinking that I knew what the right answer was, or I knew what the right pedagogy was, or the right approach, or the right way to assess students, or the right behavioural consequences. And I thought I knew it all, but I didn't. And what I learnt from that is that if you want to really influence change in a school or in an organisation, oftentimes that's not top-down. Real change, real sustainable change, lasting impact comes from bottom up. You have to engage others. You have to bring them along on that journey. You have to listen. And you have to pull all that together in order to get a positive outcome. So that's one thing.
And that must have been really difficult for you to hear at the time.
Thankfully, it wasn't direct feedback that I received from another leader, but I learnt through experience. I learnt the hard way, through blood, sweat and tears. I come in and said, right, we're all going to do this and we're all going to get on board and it's going to be great. Well, no one was on board. It wasn't great. In fact, it was horrible. And I spent a couple of years after the fact trying to repair relationships and change my approach to make sure that people felt respected and felt as though they mattered. So I learnt the hard way. It has to be about teams working together in the best interests of the school. And that's really framed the way I approach things now. The second thing that I'm thinking about, and it's a lesson I'm still learning, is this idea that you can't take things personally. Really struggle with that. Someone criticises the school. I spend 60 to 70 hours here a week. I'm going to take it personally. But I know I can't, because if I take everything personally, that's not going to be good for my health and well-being or the longevity of my career. So I have to try and segment that and make sure that if there is something within my sphere of influence or my control, that I'm responding accordingly and engaged in a process of continuous improvement. But it's not about me, often. Sometimes it is, but no, most of the time it's not about me. So I've got to learn and continually learn that it's not personal.
So what does that look like? I'm envisaging it might be an email or a review online or a piece of feedback. Talk me through your thought process.
Well, I think once upon a time I'd probably see red and I'd want to go from 0 to 100 really quick. But you learn through experiences to regulate your emotions and to check your ego at the door and to compartmentalise and put things in perspective. And I think I'm pretty good at that now. Doesn't mean it still doesn't hurt, depending upon the nature of the feedback, the email, the situation, the comment, the review. But you're able to put it in perspective and say, okay, is this something that's in my control? And if it is, I'm going to take extreme ownership and I'm going to act on it and I'm going to make things better. If it's not, I'm going to let it go.
If, let's flip it, if you didn't care, so let's envisage a situation where there was a seething piece of feedback that came about the school and you didn't care.
I wouldn't be doing my job. And this school wouldn't be in the position that it's in now. Not that I take full responsibility for that, because it is a team-based effort and we've got 500 staff here all working together really, really well and pulling in the same direction to make Westbourne an even better school than it is today. Yeah, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't care.
So you have to care.
You do, but it's a fine line. It's a balance.
Between caring and taking it too personally.
Right. So then I guess the third thing I'm thinking about in response to that question that we're exploring here in the trenches, Teagan, about what's the hardest leadership lesson that you've learned. The third thing I'm thinking about is the need to trust your intuition and your instincts. You can have all the data in the world. You can have all the advice. You can have everyone saying something or presenting a particular worldview or saying that we should be making a decision in one particular way or another. But at the end of the day, you have to weigh all that up and you really have to trust your instinct and intuition. Because in my experience, most of the time, if you do that, you'll make the right call. Some might disagree with me, but I think through the experiences I've had in my career and through the continual learning that I engage in and through the critical, constant self-reflection, dialogue that we both engage in, the work we do with our executive team, the work with the board, I believe that has all culminated into an experience that enables me to trust my judgment that sometimes is based on incomplete information, and it's a gut feel.
Can you think of a time where you didn't follow your intuition and you should have, that formed that view?
You put me on the spot.
You've been putting me on the spot all day.
Oh, so many examples I could share. I can recall situations where we made a decision that was probably not the right decision, but it was the best decision based on the data that was being presented and available, but it didn't sit right with me for some reason. It could be as simple as recruitment. You're on a recruitment panel, someone presents really well, they've got a great CV, they've got all the experience that you're looking for, you think they're going to be a good cultural fit, they knock it out of the park in an interview, but you just have this suspicion that something's not right. But then you appoint them anyway.
It's hard to hold the line on that, just that specific example. If you're in there with a panel, it's never a decision made in isolation. How do you say, it's just my gut feel? It's just my intuition. It can be hard to defend against.
The science of learning, people would be really unhappy with that, wouldn't they? The quantitative researchers amongst us wouldn't like that approach. But I think there's a place for it in schools. Not everything can be reduced to a number.
No. I think we operate in the grey more than in the black and white.
We have to. We're human. And so that's the third thing that I'm continually grappling with is trust your intuition, trust your instinct, be open to new information. But at the end of the day, if the decision sits with you, you've got to take in all that information and then try and make the right decision. So listen to what your gut is telling you. Let's wrap it up, Teagan. It's been a great conversation today. We've explored the hidden curriculum of leadership and the lessons that they don't teach you in principal professional learning programs. We've talked about the emotional intensity, the emotional labour of the job, which is often hidden from others, and the emotional resilience and fortitude that you need to navigate your way through your role. We talked about politics, capital P, little p, and how we can use the art of influence and persuasion to get a good outcome. We've also talked about the way leadership changes you. And then we've gone into the trenches and we've talked about what are the hardest leadership lessons that we've learnt so far in our careers. It's been a really good conversation. Was there anything you wanted to add before we wrap it up?
We always talk about progress over perfection. And I think that's been reflective of the conversation today, that it's always an art of becoming, an identity of becoming rather than being fixed and perhaps striving for perfection. But progress is really critical. And as leaders, we're always being formed and shaped by our experiences and what we bring to the table. So for me, as an aspiring principal, it's really critical for that point of reflection and resonates with me about the things that keep me up at night, the things that I think about, the things that we talk about that's relevant outside of the day-to-day operations. So I've really enjoyed the conversation.
No, I love that notion of an identity of becoming, because we don't have it all figured out and we're in this constant process of learning, because leadership is a journey. And I guess leaving our audience with something to reflect upon or a bit of a challenge. So for our listeners, I think the impetus for those aspiring to leadership roles, to becoming a principal, is to make sure that you're willing or have the courage to step into the unknown and to embrace the lessons that you could never have predicted or prepared for, the hidden curriculum, so to speak, because that's what will shape you in ways that perhaps you could never have imagined. Thanks, Teagan.
Thanks, Adrian.
That's a wrap on today's episode of The Principal's Perspective. We hope this conversation gave you practical insights to lead with clarity, confidence, and impact.
Leadership is a continuous journey and we'd love to keep the conversation going. You can find us on LinkedIn. Just search for Dr. Adrian Camm and Teagan Collins and let us know your thoughts, questions, or leadership wins.
Make sure to follow the Principal's Perspective on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if today's episode resonated with you, share it with someone in your network.
Until next time, keep leading with purpose, and we'll see you in the next episode. You can be sure to find any references, books, or resources we discussed today in the show notes. Please jump on into the comments and join the conversation.